Yeah.
Okay, welcome everyone to the March 29th Planning, Land Use and Economic Development Committee meeting of the Common Council. Committee members present: Judy Doche, Tom Hoey, other council members present, Richard Conti, and we have council staff, City Clerk Danielle Gillespie, and we have City Planning Department staff, Director Brad Glass, Zach Powell, and Luis Roldan. And Sam, are you staff as well?
Yes, I am.
Sam, how do you pronounce your name, Sam?
It's Moriel.
Moriel. So welcome, everyone. We're here to discuss amendments to the Unified Sustainable Development Ordinance. And we are talking about Ordinance 532-21 and Ordinance amending Article 1, General Provisions of Chapter 375 of the USDO of Part 2, the Code of the City of Albany in relation to necessary amendments. So we'll be having a series of meetings in the next months on these on proposed amendments to the USDO. And we are going to be, one of the things we're going to do is, and you had recommended this, Richard or Judy, combine the ordinances into one ordinance. So we will be amending this to one large ordinance, and we'll include the schedule on that ordinance so that the public can know about upcoming meetings. Okay. So Brad, you sent out a memorandum with some proposed changes to Article 1. And we received from you, Luis, tell me how you pronounce it. Is it Luis or Louis?
It's Luis.
Luis?
Thank you.
Pardon?
It's Luis.
Luis. You also sent out a PowerPoint. So, all right, a couple of other committee members hopefully will be joining us, but I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So who from the planning department would like to begin this discussion?
So Kathy, I think Councilmember Hoey has his hand up, but I was just wondering about the PowerPoint as well. If that's something that I should be booting up, or
okay.
you would have that.
All right. Well, Tom, hold on a second. I didn't see you. I apologize.
It's entirely up to you, Brad, either way. I could pull it up. I think I have it running in the background. Give me 1 second.
Wow, me.
I would appreciate that, just because I don't have it readily accessible at the moment.
And okay, Tom, go ahead. I'm sorry. Didn't see you.
With the these changes now, and I just want to make sure I got the correct order. We're going to change we worked on for the last few months, changing the numbering to fit into E code. Will these changes be part of that, or that's going to be, these changes are going to be further in the future? I'm just wondering what the timeline, I guess, is.
Yes, no, we're going to be hopefully voting on the text amendments sooner. And then this discussion about these are more substantial amendments to the USDO that we're going to be talking about.
Okay, thank you. So I don't have to worry about this going up in front of the council anytime soon.
No.
Okay, thank you.
In fact, if you'll notice on the schedule, on June 30th, there at caucus, we'll have a meeting where we'll begin to talk about some of the changes that have been proposed in the weeks leading up to June 30th. So it's a process.
Yeah, and I just wanted to note, we are planning to get this stuff up on the web relatively shortly. We're going to work with Dennis Gaffney at ACDA to help us do a little bit of outreach and kind of help us on the back end of making sure we're up to speed. Obviously, this is very time intensive for us. So we do want to help the council promote this in any way that they choose. But we admit we're a little bit behind the curve on that. I think what you're going to see tonight is pretty basic and straightforward, but moving forward, we do want to, advertise this a little bit more. That said, tonight we're here to talk about Article 1. A lot of it is relatively straightforward, purpose and intent language of the code, severability, how to deal with things that may have been in effect at the time the code was adopted that may not comply with the code, et cetera. And some of these are more formally or more addressed in more detail in later sections of the code. So there were a couple that we wanted to call out and just highlight in particular to get you thinking about that. But for now, we're going to we kind of divvied up the slides here, and Luis is going to take the first section 375, 102, the purpose and intent of the code.
All right, thank you, Brad. And so for 375 102 purpose, this is kind of a brief part of the ordinance, but it's important to kind of lay down what the intents are in order that kind of guides the interpretation of the ordinance to follow. So I thought that it was a good opportunity to kind of review this to make sure that we're also not only setting the intention, the purpose of the USDO, but also to take the opportunity to review if any new priorities have been developed since the original adoption of the USDO in 2017. So the first point is unchanged. The second point also is unchanged. The implement the policies of the adopted comprehensive plan as may be amended from time to time, promote economic reinvestment in the city. But the third point does have a change. And the change is where it says protect and preserve the city's residential neighborhoods. The change is made to say protect and preserve the city's neighborhoods. And also in addition, add promote and promote racial equity within. So the point of this is that the previous language of protect and preserve cities' residential neighborhoods was a little vague in its application or interpretation of what protect would mean and what preserve would mean. And it creates a little bit of a confusion as to whether or not it applies to the historic standards or whether it's referring to environmental justice issues. So in order to more narrowly focus this point here, what was added there was just a cantilever point to the first point of protect and preserve the city's neighborhoods. So the language that we have in the ordinance now as it stands, you can interpret protect as, because it's not defined in our ordinance, as preventing harm to the neighborhood under the common definition, and preserve under the common definition because it's also not defined to maintain the neighborhood in its original state. So if this broad interpretation, if applied equally, is inequitable because there are varying states of the neighborhoods around the city. And if we were aiming to prevent harm, but also maintain the original state, that's kind of, if they work in opposite directions as far as trying to be equitable to the communities that have been historically marginalized and disinvested in previous policies. So in order to first acknowledge that those policies existed and promote a purpose to reverse those harms done, the change in the language provides the opportunity for the USDO to take on that purpose of making sure that the ordinance is applied equitably as opposed to just equally. This is in response to not only the staff's recommendations have passed, but also the ongoing developments across the racial justice scene, and it's supposed to be in line with the city's already declared commitment to racial equity and justice, which is evidenced by ordinances that have been enacted, such as the Equity Agenda or the enabling law for the Equity Agenda. So it's part of a broader effort in contextualizing future recommendations through a lens of equity. This is inspired from reports identifying many inequities present in our communities with who have large populations of people who identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. This is an initial recommendation to identify and set that the equity perspective is going to be reviewed, and it intends to. It's supposed to be informing future review as well. So for it's setting kind of like the an intent for the way that we're also going to be submitting any future recommendations as well. So number 4, promoting.
Hold on a second. Maybe, Louise, as we go through this, we can stop, and if people have any comments or questions, it might be a good time to talk about that. Judy, was that you?
Yes.
Hold on a second. I just want to note that Councilmember Ginny Farrell is here, and I guess that's it. Okay, go ahead, Judy.
So, first of all, the memo that we got last week did not include and promote racial equity within. Is that memo now going to be revised to reflect this? And how are we going to go about doing this? My recommendation would be that we include these kinds of adjustments in that March 26th memo. Note that it was revised as of a particular date, and to make sure that the PowerPoint presentation that we're being provided with is consistent with the memo that we're being provided. That's first a process kind of issue, I think, directed to Brad.
Sure. So yes, we'd be happy to revise the memo. Originally, as we had this set up and the PowerPoint was running a little bit behind the memo, there was going to be a separate slide subsequent to this where we were going to speak to our general feeling of that maybe we may want to add a additional bullet to replace where we took out encourage the aesthetic quality, as well as we may want to add additional language speaking to this in bullet number 3. As we developed the PowerPoint, we concluded that we had sort of come to the conclusion of the language that we wanted to use. So we did just propose the amendment as a part of the this slide, as opposed to creating the separate slide that left it more open-ended. Obviously, that's why we're here to discuss these items. So if that language isn't working for anyone, we can certainly revisit that.
Richard, I see you have a question. Judy, you're okay with that, right?
Well, yes, but I did have, that was part 1 of my questions.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
My second, that was just a process thing. My second gut reaction is that the language should be promote racial equity throughout such neighborhoods. Because I think within does not get at the issue that there is disparity in the extent to which we're protecting and preserving all neighborhoods. And so there's a racial equity issue embedded in that as well, I think. So I think it gets at the point if we're saying promote racial equity throughout such neighborhoods.
Yeah, I like that.
Is getting at the issue that within a particular, within a particular neighborhood or group of neighborhoods, we want to be promoting racial equity, but also that throughout the city, we want to be promoting racial equity. Brad, do you have a reaction to that?
I prefer to reflect on it, but I don't know if anyone on my staff wanted to chime in or had any thoughts about that proposal.
I think that would be, in the spirit of what the recommendation is. So I think that, that would work.
Okay. Let's go to Richard Conti.
Thanks. I don't know if mine is the only screen that's flashing, but I assume no one else is. Just a formatting request, because I really didn't notice this right away. But when you're making adjustments on the statutory language, could you just please, you strike out the old, et cetera, but can you please underline the new language you're inserting so we can tell what you're adding? Because this doesn't give me any indication as to what the new language is without going back and forth and hearing you. And that would be very helpful and more transparent. Thank you.
Yes, certainly we can do that. This is truly a team effort, and we're all just kind of learning the guidelines and the particulars of, how we need to present things at these meetings. So my apologies for any mistakes. They'll be corrected next time around.
Thanks. It's always my role to nitpick. I apologize.
Okay, Tom. Councilmember Holly.
Yeah, it just takes, I'm on an iPad, so it takes a second or two to get the mute screen up. With neighborhoods, is there different definitions? Because I'm just curious about why we took out the residential. Are we thinking of like warehouse or industrial neighborhoods? Is that considered like a neighborhood? Or I'm just curious about the reasoning why we took out residential. Because the way I grew up, watching Sesame Street and stuff, it was, neighborhoods where people live, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just that most neighborhoods aren't solely residential. So just speaking more generically to the city's neighborhoods as a whole, I think that was the general intent. Luis, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to add.
Yep. So there are portions of the city that have mixed uses with residences, with residential type uses and business type uses, and those can vary. To include a word residential kind of limits that the narrow focuses a narrow perspective of number 3 to areas where the primary use allowed is residential and where other uses are not allowed. So it's to be more inclusive of areas that have mixed uses, in addition to areas where primarily the uses are only residential.
Luis, I got a follow up too, just real fast. Do we want to protect like industrial areas though? I've seen it, like I grew up in New York City, and areas that used to be just like warehouses and factories, they've turned into residential. And long term, is there industry ever going to be back there again? Is that something that goes into the planning that, if an area is meant for doing like, you're near the river and you're near loading boats and stuff like that, is that something that we'd want to protect also?
Yeah, so if you're directing a question at me, yeah, so as you mentioned, you kind of interpret the neighborhoods as being places where people live. If there are areas that are predominantly industrial uses where residential uses are not necessarily prevalent, then those don't necessarily fall under this specific purpose, but they are covered under other parts of our ordinance that does determine what uses are appropriate in those districts, so that they don't conflict with nearby residential uses. If residential uses were to come into those zoning districts, then at that point they would fall under this purpose here, and you would both be trying to prevent harm as defining protect to that area and those residents who are now living there, and also keep this. Well, it's different. You wouldn't necessarily preserve an area where residential uses weren't really there. It's kind of like a circular argument. If you're maintaining the status quo of industrial usage, that means that people could never live there. But that's not necessarily speaking to the point of rehabilitating uses that may have at one point caused brownfields, but you can be remediated and allow for residential uses. So you don't necessarily want to avoid expanding residential uses to areas where it could be a beneficial use. So you wouldn't necessarily want to stifle that with the interpretation of preserve. So by using the neighborhood portion of it, if you're understanding neighborhoods is where people live, then you wouldn't necessarily apply that. So to the typically understood industrial areas.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I could just add really quickly, I think it's an interesting point that Tom makes, because, do we want to preserve and protect every neighborhood or certain characteristic. I think that when we looked at it, that was the, and I think you all know that this has come up at some meetings and planning board meetings and otherwise preserve and protect the city's residential neighborhoods or the city's neighborhoods. It wasn't entirely clear what that meant. And it was certainly clear to us that it could be different people interpret it different ways. So that's where we were trying to bring the lens of equity into it. And I think, I think we're open to continued discussion on the language, but we did feel that there needed to be clarification as to exactly what the intent was.
One thing that occurred to me was maybe adding the word protect, preserve, and improve the city's neighborhoods. So then you kind of get at what Tom was referring to as far as that we're not going to want to preserve all the neighborhoods, but we do want to improve all the neighborhoods. That was just a thought. I should also mention that Councilmember Alfredo Ballerin is also here. Any thoughts about that?
Would that be
The
then
word
replacing-
improve.
Right. I wasn't sure if the way it was worded, was it removing promote racial equity within and replacing that with just improve?
No, I did.
You're adding at the
Just
beginning.
adding a phrase, a word. Because then you get at, do we want to preserve all the neighborhoods?
So
No,
I think,
we do want to improve them.
so I think this may be something that we will continue to look at, and we would encourage the members on the call, council members, to maybe look at it and give us some suggestions, and we can follow up on this at our next meeting and discuss, if we have concluded upon any particular language. Or we can add improve and call it a day. I'd be happy with that.
I would too. That along with the change that promoting equity throughout such neighborhoods. But
Okay,
there's more people on the committee.
Yes. Okay, I'm good with that. Anybody else? Well, why don't we move forward, and Luis, go ahead.
So number 4, promote energy conservation. We remove the comma and the word and there. Promote energy conservation, or actually I think that comma was added rather than removed. Promote energy conservation, comma, low impact development and environmentally sensitive development. So just the and was removed and replaced with a comma. I don't know if there's any discussion on that. It's just more of a grammatical.
Nope, I don't see any hands.
Number 5 remains unchanged, secure safety from fire, floodwaters, panic, and other dangers. Number 6 remains unchanged, facilitate the provision of adequate transportation, water, sanitary, and storm sewers, schools, parks, and other community facilities needed to serve new and existing development. Number 7 does have a change, promote, preserve, and we removed and encouraged the aesthetic quality and replace that with and reinforce the historic urban form and fabric of the city.
So yeah,
Okay,
and just on number 7, I wanted to add that it just felt like it was conflating 2 separate items there, encouraging aesthetic quality and then preserving historic urban fabric. So we're not opposed to adding an additional numerical item that speaks to the encouragement of aesthetic quality or design excellence or some sort of something architecturally or urban design otherwise that's not necessarily focused on the historic elements. And I think Judy had suggested.
Yeah, Judy, you offered something along those lines, right? In your email?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. So using similar language, I'm suggesting promote, preserve, encourage, and improve came up in mine. The aesthetic quality of buildings and environments throughout the city.
I could support that.
Any other comments? Okay, I agree. I think we need to have something about aesthetics because you know, I've seen a lot of, there's just so many different examples of people following the code, but it could be done in a more aesthetically pleasing way. So,
Move on to the next slide if it's ready.
Yep.
Okay, so this is Zach. I'll just be going through the changes for section 375-104 for applicability. There were no changes to the first two subsections. Under the third, we are proposing to remove the reference to inner or outer courts, and then add the word or before side yards, just to kind of end the list. We're removing this just because inner or outer courts aren't referenced anywhere else within the zoning code. And so it doesn't make sense to include something that doesn't have a definition and something that we don't see architecturally a lot within the city. You usually see inner or outer courts in larger cities with taller buildings. So are there any questions, comments, issues with that?
we do have some buildings with inner courts now. You know, the old Henkel Brewery down on, right near you, Brad, Myrtle and Swan, they have inner courts now. So I don't know if we should be including that.
I
I-
mean,
the one thing I would, oh, go ahead, Brad.
I was just gonna say, we do have them, but nothing in the code explicitly regulates them. So, you know, if we.
I guess,
it doesn't
should we
hurt
be
to keep it.
regulating them, I guess is the question at all.
I would say no, but I'm not opposed to the idea if we wanted to consider it. It wasn't anything that I consciously thought about it until I read this passage of the code. It's kind of like,
So I favor taking this out also, unless we get to, it would be Article 4 probably where this would be appear. Because it says then we're talking about it can't do this, that, or that, inner or outer courts, then is permitted by the USDO for the district. So it's confusing having it in there if there is no other regulation of it expressly addressing that. And frankly, for you know, areas that I'm aware where there's an inner court or outer court kind of thing, I'm not aware of anything that is objectionable. It's really, you know, what kind of landscaping you're requiring, which goes along with the general standards, I think.
Okay, I'm comfortable with that. Shall we go on?
Yep, thank you. Sorry, I was just taking notes. And then for subsection 4, the phrase "unless otherwise provided in this USDO" was added, and then the word "no" was uncapitalized. So this section speaks to open space or yard area for one building, not counting towards the open space or yard area for another building. And this creates some potential conflicts with certain sections of our codes. 2 examples that we came up with are cluster subdivisions, which are a type of subdivision that's approved through New York state law, which allows for people to build 1, 2, and townhouse style dwellings closer together while maintaining the same amount of lot coverage. And they use a collective dedicated open space to meet the lot coverage requirements. And then we also have a second portion of our code for district plans, which allows an applicant to submit an application to create a district from 1 or multiple properties. And that allows the applicant to meet the overall district lot coverage standards for the entire district, but may allow for greater lot coverage on 1 lot as long as the overall lot coverage for the district meets the district standards. So this is just trying to remove some of the gray area with this language. And it was utilizing similar language that's found in other portions of the code that allows for exceptions when otherwise noted.
Any questions or comments? Okay, let's move on.
All right, effective date and transition. Number 3, it sort of internally contradicts itself. It speaks to a use structure lot that was legally non-conforming at the time of the adoption of this USDO will be deemed lawful and conforming as of the effective date if it conforms to all requirements of the USDO. Well, anything is lawful and conforming as long as it conforms to all the requirements of the USDO. So the language referencing something that was legally not conforming before really doesn't need to be there, and it almost creates a contradiction of sorts, being that if it was legally not conforming at the time of adoption, it doesn't necessarily conform to all the requirements of the USDO. So it just seemed like there was a potential conflict that really doesn't add anything to that sentence or statement.
Tom, I see your hand.
Yeah, so we're rewriting the USDO, right? Because we're gonna totally take it off and then put in the new E-code version. Do we change the effective dates? Will that change on number 1? I know that's not one of the changes, but it just caught my eye.
It's an interesting question. I guess I'd seek the impact or the input of others on the call or committee. I mean, we looked at that. I guess the new effective date might be the effective date that we're readopting it. So we could go ahead and update that. We don't know the date yet, actually. Well, we might know, but it's not official, so we'll wait for that to happen.
Any other comments on this one? Okay, let's move forward.
Okay, and if you want to change the slide, it's a little bit of a segue here, just to give a brief overview of, nonconformities. So, nonconformity is typically, this is something we're going to revisit towards the end of the code, but it's important to be thinking about as we go through the code in its entirety. A condition that was legally established prior to the effective date of the USDO, but does not conform to the current regulations. So that could be the use of the property, it could be the dimensions of the lot, it could be the setbacks of the structure, signs, hours of operation, parking, and site improvements. So it's relatively complex. Our prior code only spoke to non-conforming uses, which are perhaps the most egregious form of non-conformity. The new code does speak to a broader type of things that may not conform to the current regulation. And that, I think as we get to that section, we could probably improve upon that a little bit. It is the responsibility of a property owner to substantiate and provide proof of the legality of a nonconformity by law. The chief planning official is empowered to issue a certificate of legal nonconforming based upon receipt of that proof. A nonconforming use in particular expires if it's not continuously maintained or abandoned for a period in excess of 1 year, or if the structure is destroyed to an extent more than 50% of the cost of replacement. Nonconformity generally may not be expanded in scope, although this code does allow nonconforming uses to be expanded within an existing structure, provided that there's no physical expansion of that structure, and not affected by a change in ownership or normal maintenance or repair. And 375-506 are the more detailed standards on nonconformities. This language that I'm reading from here is not the exact code language, just an overall summary. And, you know, there are one of the things we tried to do when we adopted the USDO was decrease the number of nonconformities in the city. Some of that accommodated, in some cases, new development that in some cases, you know, created some challenges. So I think it's in balancing we need to respect our existing fabric in homes and communities, but we also need to set a vision for what we want new development to look like in the future. So it's a balance of the two, but we always need to be thinking when we're changing rules in the code, what we're doing about those properties that will no longer comply, because that could affect someone's ability to get a mortgage or a loan to improve that structure. And that's my overall just briefer on nonconformities, and I'm happy to answer any questions on that subject while we're here, or we can move on.
Okay, any questions or comments?
And those are the city's prior codes, so we'll add whenever we adopt the updated copy edited version. That'll kind of go in the pool with the September 9th 1993, which wasn't a full code rewrite. It was sort of a semi-update of the May 1968 ordinance. But when we're trying to document nonconformities, really our zoning goes all the way back to 1924. So it can get complex in some cases when we're dealing with older structures. It's also important to remember that I don't know the exact percentage, but a very substantial portion of our city was built prior to 1924, where there was no zoning in effect. So there was nothing guiding that development. Some of which we like, but we need to be conscious of that as we write our current codes and ordinances, that still exists, and it may never comply with the building codes or other elements that we apply moving forward.
Okay, Brad, I don't see any other hands or.
Okay, and then effective date of transition. We don't believe this section is, well, I didn't believe it was relevant, but now based upon what Tom just said, it may become relevant again. So I think we're going to remove this removal and restore what's originally in the code. And we may want to just take another look to make sure we don't want to change or tweak anything. But as of the 2017 code, there are no pending applications or approved projects that under the prior code that are still in existence or pending as far as we're aware.
And then so for subsection 107, this relates to interpretations. So I'll read the current text right now. So this says the chief planning official shall be authorized to interpret the provisions of this USDO, including but not limited to the location of zoning district boundary lines, unless a different city official is specifically designated in this USDO to make a particular interpretation. The decisions of the chief planning official are subject to appeal to the Board of Zoning Appeals. An applicant may request that a formal written interpretation of this USDO be made by the Board of Zoning Appeals. So in our department's recommendations, we're proposing to remove the last sentence, which allows an applicant to request a formal interpretation by the Board of Zoning Appeals, and then change the phrase the decisions and the second to last sentence to interpretations to reflect the action that the chief planning official is taking. And so these changes have come up because it creates a somewhat confusing process to have two separate options for an applicant in order to achieve or get an interpretation on a specific issue. Doing further research on this, we found through state law that interpretation by the Board of Zoning Appeals should only be appellate in nature. So functionally, there has to be a city official that denies something for the applicant to appeal through an administrative appeal and have the BZA interpret the administrative appeal. So this is trying to separate out two separate functions within the city code. So I think as Councilmember Doche had mentioned in an email right before the meeting, there are opportunities to improve and provide more opportunity for public comment with interpretations that are made by the chief planning official in instances where there's not an application or situation presented to the chief planning official. And similarly, this kind of clarifies the distinction between the interpretive process done by the chief planning official and the administrative appeals process, which is more appropriate for situations where an application has been submitted to a city department and there needs to be clarification on said issue. So I think this is an opportunity for the code to provide more opportunity for transparency and more opportunities for public comment, but also to make sure that the sections of the code are aligning with New York State law and the purposes and functions of both the chief planning official as well as the Board of Zoning Appeals. And if Danielle, if you could go to the next slide, please. Great, thank you. So our department's offering that there could be different ways to define the process for an interpretation and clarify what opportunities or times are appropriate for an interpretation, the process for the chief planning official making interpretations, how long an interpretation should be posted on the city's website, should there be an opportunity for public comment at a formalized meeting or just through written correspondence, and also trying to make sure that interpretations for relatively small issues are not holding up smaller projects. A lot of instances like this could be something as small as a resident wanting to install a swimming pool in their backyard or install a fence. So trying to make sure that while providing the transparency and more opportunities for public comment, that it's not creating additional delays for smaller projects where usually those applicants are experiencing a number of issues. Just trying to understand and become acquainted to our processes in general.
Okay, Tom, I see you have a comment.
Yeah, and this is the only section that when I read it, I had problems with. The USDO, the O stands for ordinance, and the ordinance is created by the Common Council, the legislative body of the city of Albany. And my feeling is that there should be, for interpretation, if we're creating the law, it should be our interpretation of the law. And in a way, if we were more involved in that, for situations like you just had said about maybe a little tiny thing with a swimming pool, that if we're dealing with these little issues, we would be able to change the law because we created this document. This is our responsibility. I'm not saying we sat down and wrote it. We had, you guys were involved, and we had, we hired out people to come up with this. But the bottom line is the ordinance is from the council, and I don't like it. To me, it's putting too much eggs in one basket. I really think we need to come up with a better way to do it. Whether it's, the planning committee of the council would help in the interpretation, or the full council, or certain members of the council. But in my mind, the interpretation should be made by the council since it's an ordinance. Thank you.
Does someone want to respond to that from the planning committee, from the planning staff?
To speak to that. So I think when we were thinking of interpretations, I think these are kind of short transition periods where it would allow for issues to be resolved in between the time that we might notice an issue that's not coming from a specific project, but we might be reading the code one day and notice an issue and want to address it. So it might avoid issues in the short term. But I think it's a good opportunity for us to be looking at timeframes for putting forward changes through the text amendment process, since that is, the function that the council serves, and the eventual function that the council should be able to serve and decide upon within these situations. So I think this is trying to address things on more of a short-term lens. Things are still going to go through administrative appeals if it's being reviewed for a specific project, and that might warrant future text amendments. Or if it's a large enough issue, then maybe an interpretation for the short term, but then again, maybe set deadlines or expiration dates in order for the council to view it as a text amendment.
Now, we meet every 2 weeks, so it's not like we don't, we meet more than the planning board actually meets. I mean, they do have the workshop, and again, I'm thinking if we had some kind of committee with people from the council, people from planning, and maybe some other areas to deal with these things, you're closer to the problem. We would see it a lot easier. And I think we could react a lot more. And it wouldn't be like everybody's creating a little silo. It'd be more sharing of this, huge project that's, which is a great plan, but I think a lot of us felt we're kind of pushed out. And we went through, even a court case to show that, this is the council's responsibility. So it's something I'd really like us to think about. And, I'll talk around to the other council members, but I'm just letting you know, I definitely want to work with you guys, but I think we need to kind of, see if we can do things better. And it'll never be perfect, but we change as needed. Maybe it wouldn't work out, then we make some changes, but you really got to get, I think with the interpretation, having it done by one person, the chief planning officer, it's just, yes, you can go and do an appeal, but I think it'd be a lot faster if a guy came in with a swimming pool and the council's meeting every 2 weeks, that this thing comes up. It's more work on us. My fellow council members might not be too happy with me, but I think we could deal with things a lot faster. We can discuss them and we can get, instead of taking 6-10 months, we could be making changes monthly. I mean, but and I haven't talked to anybody about this. I maybe should have sent an email, but I didn't. I figured we'd talk about it tonight. Thank you.
Okay, Judy?
That Councilmember Fahey.
Have a little bit of patience with me on this one, because I have a lot of thoughts that are going through my mind. Tom, first of all, a government would shut down if every time there needs to be an interpretation of anything the legislature, New York State legislature, or any body passed, they needed to go back to that body. That's not to say that I don't share some of your concerns about how things have been being done and how do we make it work better. There's also an issue in general that I think that we all need to be mindful of, that an interpretation, so we're amending this to say an interpretation, the chief planning official has the authority to issue an interpretation. And this really, an interpretation is usually only going to arise because there's some project or something happening in which there's actually a decision being made. The thing about an interpretation is and planning staff has appropriately commented that we need to come up with probably a definition of, what is the distinction that we're making here. An interpretation is, the goal of an interpretation is, now this is how we are viewing this for this particular application. It's arisen, the issue has arisen, and how do we think it should be applied uniformly, not just to this particular application, to this particular property. You're looking at the USDO and you want to treat everybody similarly. So embedded in a decision really should be, an interpretation of the USDO, unless the USDO is perfectly clear on it. So that's something we need to iron out here. Personally, I think a lot of this belongs in Article 5, where we set forth the responsibilities of the different people and different bodies. So we have, the responsibilities of the chief planning official, the responsibilities of the director of planning, the responsibilities of the chief building official, board of zoning appeals, planning board, et cetera, and us is all laid out there. And that also then sets forth the process and the criteria that you use. So I think it belongs there. I think the details of that belong there. I'm not quite sure what to do with this particular provision here about this. Tom, with regard to your, I think your concerns, one of my general thought has been that anytime there's a proposed decision, especially where there's an interpretation that might be raising a unique issue, that we want it to be posted on the website. And I think the Common Council should have be advised of that. And then whether we set a 10-day span or a 14-day span for the Common Council basically say, we disagree with this, rather than saying, you can't issue any interpretations, to say, give us advance notice and we're going to take a look at it, maybe talk to an applicant that this applies to, look at the properties around it. How do we feel about this? Is this a good decision / interpretation, regardless of whether it's in an R2 district or an RM district or a mixed use district or a form-based district? Is it too broad? So some of those kinds of things should be looked at. And I think, while we meet every 2 weeks, if there's a need for a change, generally it would go through a committee process, it would go through a review process. There would be some discussion, there would be a hearing on it. And so really we're talking about something that potentially is, it's not a 2-week process. It is a 2 to 3 month process that I don't think we want every single minor issue going through that process. And how do you decide minor versus more significant? And I think the answer is to have the proposed decision posted for the council to be directly advised through our senior legislative aide or whoever, and that immediately is shared with all council members. And then what is the process there? I have suggested in one case that then if you have a majority of council members basically saying, I object, this should be reviewed, and then put a stay on something, and not to be taken, hopefully not to be taken lightly if that kind of thing is going to happen. That is something I've been toying with. That is an idea that I've been toying with in terms of how do we not gum up the works, but have an opportunity to be informed. The other thing is,
any thoughts from the planning department on that idea? Posting interpretations.
We support that. I think I think it makes sense. It puts a little more onus on us to make sure we're thinking clearly and properly communicating what the issues are. I think that I think as Judy stated, I had some of the same concerns about the way Tom proposed it, although I do understand his concerns that, as a legislative body, you should be able to have an input in the changing of the law, essentially. There's also cases, I think, where there needs to be better discretion exercised as to what is sent to the Board of Zoning Appeals, as opposed to being solely the decision of the chief planning official. So I think the Board of Zoning Appeals, now that they have a diminished role in terms of the number of variances that they're receiving, could play a part in helping to resolve some of the conflicts as well.
Judy, I'm sorry, did you have something else that you wanted to mention?
I think the other principle that I had ingrained with me as part of administrative law is there should always be an opportunity for notice and opportunity to be heard. And that being heard doesn't necessarily mean go to a full-blown hearing. There's plenty of case law out there that says you meet your constitutional obligations for potentially impacting somebody's property right by providing them with notice and an opportunity to be heard. And that can be via a written process, somebody submitting their opinion, and then there can be a final determination depending upon, what level. But those are the two basic principles I'd like to get in there, is that notice, and I think the notice going to the Common Council as well as potentially affected property owners, and then the opportunity to respond potentially before the decision becomes final. And, in some cases, making that a very quick turnaround. I think that's the main other thought that I had, but we're going to be working on this. Maybe there will be more thoughts.
Okay.
Kathy, can I respond to
Yes.
Judy, if you don't mind, and to Brad?
Yep.
And again, nothing's set in stone with me. I'm very open to, working things out. One of the things I'd like to see is we went through an experience where there was a deed restriction and it was just totally ignored. And I felt it should have been maybe appealed. It should have gone beyond what it went. So that's what I'm looking for, is that if there's something there major, that we don't lose, that ordinance power. And the other thing is that I'd like to see is that if stuff is posted, I really, that sounds more and more like a good idea, that we can correct the USDO as we go along. It's not like a big formal thing that, we got to wait, 6 months or a year or 4 years, whatever it is, to make changes. That if we see constant, maybe it's a certain size of a swimming pool, for example, that we can then adjust the USDO. So I'm open, and I appreciate everybody listening. Thank you.
Okay, I neglected to mention that Councilmember O'Brien, Mike O'Brien's also here, and additional staff from the Planning Department, Aaron Glennon. And Judy, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'm realizing that two things that I was thinking of is, I'm thrilled that Planning Department agrees that we should put interpretations online. If there's, these interpretations, people should have a way of knowing that that's now the standards, that's the way it's being applied, so that when they're bringing their own case, or they're looking at doing a development, they are aware of essentially those tweaks, maybe in the USDO, or if they see an ambiguity, then they can figure it out also. So it's looking to apply the USDO uniformly. I think it also can help staff within the department and Mr. LaJoy and his crew become aware of what is, what has been changed, what interpretations have been made. And finally, my thought is that as we get notice of these things, we may or may not decide, okay, let's make that change. Let's provide that clarification directly in the USDO, or we may decide that it's not necessarily necessary. Certainly, all of those kinds of interpretations should be looked at, I think, on the annual review that is anticipated in the USDO. And if there are things in the meantime that the council feels really should be addressed as a result of us getting the notice of these kinds of interpretations, then certainly we can address it. But I don't think that we necessarily want to be, we have a lot to do, you know? So I don't necessarily think we want to be every time every decision comes out, jumping to and introducing an ordinance to address that, unless it points to a real ambiguity or an inconsistency, or we just plain, you know, a loophole that we just plain don't agree with or something.
Okay, we've gone through all the items on the memorandum that the planning department presented to us. Does anyone else have any other issues with Article 1 that they'd like to raise, or any other comments by the planning department as well before we wrap the meeting up? We're going to be meeting again on
Kathy, I just want to go
April
back.
6th.
I just want to go back to the question about whether we revise and how we revise, or whether we keep the language regarding the effective date. I don't know. I think we should be looking at that, but I think that as time goes on, we will reach the conclusion either we're going to repeal and replace the USDO with all the changes we're making, or we're going to amend it. I favor amending it, even though it can be somewhat cumbersome to do. And that can impact the language in that, because previously, because that language treats it as though we're repealing and replacing again. I just want to note that. So I don't want staff to spend a lot of time on that until we reach a conclusion, I think, one way or the other. And I see that Richard Conti has his hand up.
Oh, okay, go ahead, Rich. I didn't see that.
No, I didn't have my hand up, but I agree with Judy in terms of amending versus repeal and replace.
I got a question. Are we amending and replacing for the E code though? Is that, I thought that was like, can somebody just go over the timeline, what we're going to do before we break up? So I'll have a rough idea. Like, what meeting are we going to do that?
Well, I think that's Danielle. We have a public hearing on
Monday.
Monday. So after that, and we heard back from the county. So I think we're all set, right? So we could vote on it on Monday, correct?
Okay, good.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess where I was unclear, I wasn't sure if that was a real repeal and replace, or if that was an amendment.
That was a repeal and replace, wasn't it?
That one is because of it, it's just so extensive, but those are all technical and formatting corrections. But yes,
Does that
one
affect the effective date language? And we can come back. I mean, there's going to be things I think we identify that we need to come back to, like the chief planning official, the interpretation section. We're proposing a change there. We may want to just kind of flag that as like, this is going to be affected by something we look at in Article 5. So, you know, we're not totally agreeable on that until we're totally agreeable on Article 5. So we'll try and find a way to do that in our documents so that we're aware that we need to come back to them.
I think you should change the date, because, you know, you're repealing it. Now you're putting a new one in. All that would change. I would just change the date for now. And if you want to change anything else in it, do it, you know, with the amendments. But in my mind is that this is not the same document that we put in 2017, that there's been changes, you know, and we repealed it. I mean, that's me.
If I can chime in there. I don't know. I mean, we didn't address that when it went through committee. And I don't know that it makes any difference because we very carefully looked to take out any real substantive amendments. There might be a clarification or two that that I think has already been the interpretation of the USDO. But there's no real substantive changes that make that, that have a real, at least there shouldn't be any real impact of this. It's simply the renumbering. And if I can clarify for Brad and his staff, the difference between a repeal and a replace and an amendment is an amendment has every single change, has the entire original document, which at this point, moving forward, will be our renumbered document, because that's what is going to be on the books at the time that we push through any other amendments. So we'll be using that, and then any change is either struck out or it's underlined as new language. And so the entire document would appear in that format where we are showing to the world every single change that we are making in this new document. A repeal and replace kind of deprives the public of the opportunity to see everything that we're changing in it, because you're simply saying, okay, we've done away with that. Now here's a completely new document, and nothing's underlined and nothing is struck out. So that's one of the reasons why I favor an amendment as opposed to a repeal and replace, so that people can really see where we're making changes. And that includes, members of the public, developers, any property owner in the city, I think would appreciate knowing where we've made these tweaks or significant changes in this, because they've gotten used to this document as it exists from what we adopted 4 years ago. So I hope that clarifies. So the reason why we didn't do an amendment for the current technical amendments is because when I saw the red line version, I saw that everything that was being added was not underlined, and everything that was being repealed was not even necessarily shown and struck out. So.
Okay, thanks, Judy. That was helpful.
Was it?
I might get nightmares again from that. It's all good.
Okay, anybody else before we adjourn? We're meeting again on April 6th, so Tuesday, and we'll be discussing Article 2. All right, well, thank Richard, yes.
I guess because you talked about revising, I don't know if you're going to revise any of these documents and then posting them, or what did you have in terms of plans as far as posting documents that are under consideration online?
Well, I'm meeting with Dennis tomorrow in the to get his assistance in doing that. So I'm hoping that will speed us along. I don't know that I can give you an exact date, but the new website is pretty easy to work with, so we should be able to get something up there pretty quickly. It may need to be refined over time.
Okay. I mean, to the extent we can get this information out so the public has access early as we're moving forward, I think it would be helpful so that they feel involved or can comment, etc. Thank you.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I can put today's PowerPoint on the Common Council's Facebook page and also as a supporting document for tonight's meeting, and the public will have it that way in the interim while you work out how you're going to present it going forward with Dennis.
Danielle, but Brad, you've got to update that memorandum, though. You had talked about doing that.
Yeah, that's right.
To include
Yeah,
some of the changes that you made later on.
sure.
And
So
could you
we'll,
do that and then send it to Danielle?
yeah.
And Danielle, that's great if you can post that until we get this, until you work that out with Dennis Gaffney, I guess. All right, if there's nothing else, motion to adjourn. Thank you, everyone.
Motion.
Thank you.
Motion by Judy, second by Alfredo. All right, thank you, everyone. Have a good night.